Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it's time for the Q&A, so let's go ahead and knock this out. Alright, first question. Would forearms get any benefit from doing isolation movements for 3 or 4 sets each session on the basis that volume is king? Or doing compound movements would already allow reaching a threshold of almost optimal growth, rendering isolation not so useful? Alright, great question. Forearms fall into the area of maybe, and the only reason I say that is that forearms seem to be very much more stamina-oriented muscle fibers, kind of like calves. So they tend to respond very, very well to volume. However, like with everything else, it kind of comes to the point of how much volume is enough. I mean, how much pulling and everything are you doing where you're using your forearms a lot? Someone like me, I mean, a lot of people do note that, yeah, especially when they see my arm bend or whatever from the side, my forearms are pretty big. I don't train my forearms directly. I just don't own a set of straps. I don't own a set of straps. And because I do a lot of overhand pulling also, it tends to build the radial brachialis and all that other stuff. And it's hard to say, because when we look at research, I mean, people are like, well, what's the research say? The research says people who do compounds and significant volumes don't gain any muscle from isolation work. Now, anecdotally, we could argue that a lot of bodybuilders and other people do seem to gain muscle in areas they isolate on top of it, but we've not been able to replicate that in a lab, like in a human study. And that's kind of the problem you run into with this concept of anecdotally, maybe, but can we prove it? We don't have actual evidence of this, and then we get to something like the forearms, and it's hard to say. And you know what I would say? Here's what it comes down to. It comes down to how much volume are you actually stimulating your forearms with. And like with anything else, here's the million-dollar question. Can you isolate it personally without causing inflammation to get the extra volume? Because we know forearms, at least in theory, should respond very well to volume. There's going to be another question about that later coming up in this segment. So in theory, if forearms really were lagging and you wanted to do some heavy wrist curls, I don't mean the stuff with little 20-pound dumbbells. I mean, get your deadlift up to 400 plus for work sets. Get your pin lay rows to 225 plus for work sets. And then you will have strong enough forearms to actually do some real work with them. Wrist curls with an actual heavy weight, then maybe, yeah, I mean, you could do it as long as it's not impeding your recovery, impacting your ability to grip weights later, causing inflammation in your forearms. If you can do so without doing that, and you feel like this is a weak point for you that you just want to work on, then by all means do so. But like with any other isolation movement, just make sure that your recovery can handle it, that you're not causing inflammation that's going to interfere with your overall training. And I've seen a lot of this. I see guys who end up using a lot of straps because their forearms are sore and inflamed, and then they do extra forearm work and stuff, and it's just a vicious cycle. The reality is they probably should be ditching the straps and not be doing the direct work, and it would balance out better. But again, you've got to balance that and assess that for yourself, and it's that simple. All right, next question. Hey Jason, how do manual laborers develop massive forearms? Since progressive overload is required to see continual gains, theoretically after 3 weeks of doing their work, they shouldn't see any more gains other than from occasional harder days. Yet we still see a lot of them develop massive popeye-esque forearms. All right, this kind of goes back to the other point about forearms responding very, very well to volumes of training. And here's the thing. Because these are people who have to induce higher workloads in their forearms than a lot of gym rats do, and they're having to do it every day, their forearms are forced to adapt, and they adapt by eventually hypertrophying. And what you also notice, a lot of manual laborers have large hands too. I've noticed that too. It tends to hypertrophy the muscles even in their hands because they end up doing so much workload over time. And here's the thing to consider. Yes, they occasionally have a higher workload day. Well, when you see this, when you realize that some of these manual laborers have been doing manual labor for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and they're having to do high volume at probably 5 days a week, gripping and pulling, and whether it's moving bricks or turning wrenches or swinging hammers, all these different things, over time, all the high volume stimulates a certain amount of hypertrophy. You're right, and in theory it should stop, but it's also able to maintain everything that they have. In other words, the high volume of workload they do forces their forearms to maintain whatever size they get. And occasionally they have a really high workload day. Well, what do we know about a high workload day? If you have a high workload day, you stimulate growth from it, right? And then later, lighter workouts, as long as they're done in a relatively short period of time behind it, can reinforce the training response and cause you to grow again. So here's the thing. Let's say each of those guys over the course of 5 years, they have a high workload, but not super intense, 5 days a week. And then they have, once a month, they end up having a day maybe where they have to work a lot harder and pick up a bunch of heavier stuff. Well, for the next week or two, all the other lighter, higher volume reinforces that signal. So their forearms probably grow from that once every month or so day where they have to exert harder. And that accumulates over months and years. And the end results are, you see a lot of manual laborers with big ass forearms. When you understand it in that context, it makes sense. So hopefully that explains it. All right, next question. How do you program multiple goals that have crossover? For example, using more weight on push press reduces the weight I can bench for a week. To manage recovery, I have to stagger lifts. On individual lifts, I try to peak every 10th session and make rep gains the second peak and weight gains the third peak. Gains are slow. Recovery seems to be the limiting factor. I'm a 210-pound early intermediate. Well, yeah, you're an intermediate lifter. It's going to go slower. Welcome to reality, something we all have to deal with. The golden era, the noob gains are done. Well, it sounds like you're doing it. You're like, I have to stagger my lifts a bit. If I go really, really hard on the push press, it affects my bench press. Well, isn't that normal? Adjust your frequency, your intensity, and your volume to accommodate. That's going to happen. But you know what? You can train in both as long as you do it that way. And kind of look at what I'm doing with the way I'm splitting up my own training. I have 2 separate pressing days, but they're different lifts, so that I'm able to really focus on each lift on a separate day with enough volume to stimulate growth, to stimulate adaptation, but there's an overlap of muscle protein synthesis. And I think that's the way that we need to look at that. We've got to balance these things better in light of the modern science, looking at athletes and everything. We know that each muscle group needs to be hit directly twice a week with sufficient volume to stimulate growth. Well, if you split those obviously into slightly different days, you're hitting similar muscle groups and you're getting that muscle protein synthesis overlap. The difference is that you have to find that threshold that you can get away with. In some cases, for a really advanced lifter, you might even need to do concurrent style training. And eventually that's something I will rotate into myself. For what I'm doing right now, I'm doing just, relatively high volumes of triples, trying to progress on each of these lifts, like my strict press and bench press on different days. But at a certain threshold, when you reach a certain level of advancement, if you're really trying to balance out hitting a max on these lifts with hypertrophy training, you might have to do concurrent style training. In other words, you might have to rotate higher volume days with max effort days and stagger them in the sense that, let's say your push press day is Monday and your bench press day is Thursday, you might need to hit a titrate up to a single on Monday on the push press, and then Thursday do your volume for the bench, and then the next week flip-flop it. Next week you do your volume on the push press, whether it's triples or fives or whatever, and then you titrate up to a max on the bench press. Sometimes when you're training for multiple goals at once, it does require some staggering and concurrent training once you reach a certain threshold. I think where you're at as an early intermediate, you may not need to do that yet, though. You just probably need to regulate your intensity a little more. All right, next question. I know you despise him, but would be good to hear your thoughts on Layne Norton's PHAT training, power hypertrophy adaptive training, in regards to achieving optimal aesthetics for a natty lifter, as it seems to fall in line with a lot of your current training philosophies, i.e. progressive overall strength by focusing on developing power and strength by developing the big 3, which should then carry over when it comes to progressing strength with the other accessories, push, pull, legs, hypertrophy, focus, lifts. All right. No, it doesn't really always match in line with what I'm saying, and the reason for it is kind of what I broke down before. You guys remember back in my ice cream fitness days before I had these problems with Layne? I didn't have any problems with Layne. I didn't dislike him in any way. I knew he was a fake natty. But I was very tactful back then. I didn't call out fake natties. And when I was asked this before, I made a video answering this saying I would not recommend fat for a natural lifter. And I stated that flat out. And I've always held that stance. And I kind of think it goes back to the point. I really, really can't even humor anyone that thinks that Layne did all this natty. I mean, his training style, his injuries. I'm sorry, but if you buy that, you've not been in the iron game very long. You're a noob and you haven't been around, or you're brainwashed. You're drinking the Kool-Aid. Compare PHAT to even West Side style training, which is the same sort of template in regards to it being almost an upper-lower type concurrent training. Well, the problem is Layne's total volume recommendations for this PHAT template seems to even exceed what the West Side guys do. And Louis Simmons always admits that West Side really kind of, to train like they do, you really need drugs to recover. And I have known personally quite a few natties, just observing, reading forums, interacting with people who tried PHAT, and they had overuse problems, they had overtraining problems. It was just too much for them to recover from. Their injury rates went up, inflammation went up. This is a template you wouldn't run even year-round if you were using drugs. All right, I'm just going to be honest. This would be a short-term template in the middle of someone's cycle. I wouldn't recommend it for anyone else. And the reason is, I mean, look again. West Side, you've got upper-lower 4 days a week. You have max effort days combined with dynamic effort days, which is speed work, dynamic effort. And then sometimes they run phases where you take the speed work out and replace it with hypertrophy work. PHAT runs 5 days a week. Upper, lower, and then almost like some sort, it's not almost push-pull legs, but not really. Because I think he has like a shoulder and back, if I remember correctly, then a chest and arms, and then a leg day for the final 3. But you have 2 power days, which really aren't even power days. They're more 5, so it's general strength building. Again, a fair amount of volume. And then you're doing speed work followed by hypertrophy work 3 days a week. You're not even doing like the West Side 2 days a week of either dynamic effort, speed work, or hypertrophy kind of. It's this combination, and you're in the gym 5 days a week using high volume 5 days a week. I'm sorry, but natty lifters do not make great progress doing this. They build up inflammation, they build up overuse injuries, they burn out. All right, so no, this isn't anywhere near ideal, and I made that clear many, many years ago, even before Layne and I had problems. So I've been consistent on that. But again, fake natties who convince thousands of people they are natty are able to put out programs and templates that they think are great that aren't going to work for natties, and this is just another example. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.